Hey teachers! So I recently got back from a field trip that I took with my earth science classes to Congaree National Park. And I thought there's a lot that goes on with planning a field trip, so I decided to do a series on field trips. One of the first steps to planning your field trip is to choose a venue. So what I'm going to do is share with you some tips and tricks on how to eliminate some certain places that may not work and choose the place that you think would be best suited for your students. When you first start planning a field trip, it's best to have somewhat of an idea of where you want to go. But sometimes it's hard to narrow down all of the different places if you have a lot of ideas. So one of my tips is that before you go to administration to ask for approval for your field trip, is to have at least 3 places in mind. I'm going to share with you 6 things to think about when you are trying to decide on a place for your field trip. So just as a disclaimer, I am a middle and high school teacher. So a lot of these things are going to be kind of more geared toward middle and high school, but a lot of these tips can also be filtered down into elementary as well. So the first tip is content. Typically think about a month and a half to 2 months ahead of time. And think about maybe a general idea of what you think you'll be teaching then. For example, I took my students on a field trip to Congaree National Park. And the reason why I chose that place was because I was going to be teaching about the hydrosphere. So I was going to be teaching about watersheds, rivers, the water cycle, floodplains, etc. So a lot of those things are found in Congaree National Park. And just a tip, you can really make almost anywhere a field trip. So you can look into national parks, state parks, metro parks, events like concerts or plays or famous speakers coming to your town, museums, zoos, science centers, amusement parks, movie theaters, ice rinks, escape rooms, the beach, animal shelters, factories, greenhouses, government buildings, farms, historical sites. There's a lot of places that you could do. So thinking about all those places, choose about 3 to 5 that you want to focus on. And then you can even contact them, look up on their website, see if there's any educational programs out there that they have available for you. If they don't really have an educational program, then you might want to think about that as well, because then you will have to create your own content for the place that you're going to visit. The next tip is cost. There's lots of things that you need to think about. You need to think about entrance fees, gas prices, food costs for each of your students. You need to think about your driver, if you're paying your driver, a substitute for you for the day, and then even vehicle maintenance. A lot of those things go into the cost of your field trip. So my school has a form that you actually have to fill out, and it has all those things written out for you. So you can kind of add them all up and then divide it by the number of students and then figure out the cost it's going to be per student. So then you have to pay for the driver. So look at the amount that you pay for the driver per hour and then multiply it by the number of hours needed. Next is to think about food price. So typically there's 3 things that you could do for the food. So you can either buy food there, which is typically more expensive, or you can bring it's like a bunch of sack lunches for all of your students, or you can have your students pack their own lunch. I would advise though with that to bring some snacks of your own, because there might be some students that either forget or maybe they just don't have the money to really pack a really nice good lunch. So you might want to think about that as well. And the last thing that typically goes into the cost is to think about a substitute. So if you're teaching multiple subjects and you're going to be gone for the whole day, then you might need to pay for a sub to come in and sub for you. Some schools, that's just a part of the field trip cost. You don't have to take that into account when you're looking at your field trip, but other schools do. So just kind of look into that as well. Okay, the next tip to think about is the time you're going to spend. Think about how long do I want to be on this field trip? Do I want it to be a day trip where we just go and come back in the school day? Or do you want it to be a multi-day trip where you spend the night? Typically that's more costly, so kind of think about that as well. This also may affect where you can go. There may be some places that don't really have lodging for you, so you'll have to pay like for a hotel room or something like that. And so kind of you want to keep that into account as well. You also want to think about drive time. So when we went to Congaree, it was about a 2.5-hour drive. And I wanted to just make it a day trip so we weren't taking multiple days of school. And it was fine. Like we went and we got to explore a lot, but we were in the car about the same amount of time that we were in the park itself. You also want to think about this for your students too, like how long you might want to spend with your students. If you're with middle schoolers, they're probably going to start getting crazy after being on the bus for a couple hours. So if you, like I had my high school students and like they were fine. Like they just chilled on the van and they were on their phones honestly most of the time. And some would interact a little bit, not a ton. So you kind of want to think about that as well. Especially if you're like younger grades, you're probably going to need stuff for them to do while they're on the bus because otherwise they're going to go nuts. Okay, next thing to consider is the season. So you want to think about the time of year. If you're going in the winter, it's probably going to be pretty cold outside. So if you're going to an outdoor location, then you're going to have to bring lots of stuff for your students and for you to keep warm. You also want to check into the location itself and see if it's closed during some times of the year. So especially with like parks, like national parks, state parks, metro parks, sometimes especially certain areas can be closed during certain times of the year. If it's an event, then you want to check when the event is, and again, if it's going to be outside or inside, and what the weather could potentially be like. You also want to think about rain. So when we went to Congaree, it started pouring down rain, like right when we were leaving, so it was good timing. But if it was like about an hour or two earlier, like the whole field trip kind of would have just gone up. But we looked into it and there is a lot of rain in Congaree, so typically you kind of want to look at that as well. Another thing with Congaree is it can get a lot of bugs and mosquitoes throughout the year. And so we were going kind of at the beginning of the mosquito bug season. So it really wasn't too bad, but you want to kind of look into that as well. You also want to check and see if there are any seasonal programs at your location. So some parks do special programs, like especially during the summer or spring, and even educational programs. So you might be able to do a certain program if you just wait like a couple weeks and they might have something that comes up for you to do. So next thing to think about is transportation. So you want to think about, do you have a bus? Can you take a van? Does the school have these for you to use? Or do you have to ask parents to drive? Or even are you going to drive? So a lot of that can be kind of stressful to try to find a driver. So you kind of want to think through that as well. Okay, last thing to consider is your students. So think about how many students you have, how many chaperones you might need, and you might want to think about your venue too, because some venues may not allow a certain number of students. So I'm going to be teaching a zoology class next year, and I wanted to be able to take them to this animal shelter that's like about 5 minutes from our school. And I kind of wanted them to have some interactive time, some experience while they're at this animal shelter, but they actually don't allow large groups like ours to come. So it's kind of a bummer. So I have to kind of try to find something else. And then kind of a bonus point is just to ask around. Ask some teachers, ask your administration, even ask your students about some ideas. Especially if you're kind of new to the area. Like my husband and I just moved down here a couple months ago, and so I don't really know a lot of what's around here. But you can kind of talk to your students and parents and get some ideas of some places that you might want to go. It also helps if you have been there before. So I had already been to Congaree before, and I really didn't spend a ton of time there the first time, but it still helped because I knew the layout a little better, so I could help kind of lead the students around. And even teach them a little bit about the park as we walked around because I knew where places were. And those are my 6 tips for finding your venue for a field trip. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, make sure you like and subscribe below. Thanks. Bye.